I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you very much to Bruce Lawson for that introduction. I don't know how anybody can come on a stage after Bruce is on here. He has such a presence, so this is fun to be here. And yes, this is a brand new talk that I'm debuting here, and so I'm a little bit terrified and nervous about how this is going to go, because we're going to find out together whether these ideas make any sense to you. So let's just go ahead and dive in. Well, that was kind of weird how that jumped around. I'm sorry about that jumpy text, but this quote is interesting from a man named Benjamin Franklin. Actually, technically, the idea comes from this Christopher fellow, but Benjamin Franklin is often credited with this quote, saying, "Nothing can be certain in life except for death and taxes." And we are going to talk. I don't have anything to say about taxes. I'm not going to make political statements about that, but we are going to talk about death, but not about people dying. That's way too macabre for a conference. So we're going to talk about ideas dying. And I think really, truly, all great ideas must die, but not just die, they die and then they're reborn as better ideas. That's the best ideas of all, are the ones that have died and been reborn. So, well, the font was loaded, but that was still loading very jankily. You know what, let me fix that real quick. Let's see here. I'm gonna go and disable progressive rendering, and then refresh. Well, that loaded a little bit better, kind of delayed, but a little bit better. So let's keep going. It can be said that the only constant is change, as the philosopher Heraclitus said. I don't even know if that's how you say his name, but Heraclitus sounds good to me. He said that the only constant is change. Actually, you know that black and white text, that's really bothering me. Let's fix this one more time. What I'm going to do is switch on dark mode. That's much better. There we go. Okay, so perfect. So, I mean, honestly, we're the ones viewing these slides, right? We should make this feel good to us. It doesn't matter who wrote these slides. We should make it look good to us. So we're talking about death and taxes, as I was mentioning, and really just the death of ideas. And if the death of an idea sounds too grim to you, let's think about it more like ideas that change, ideas that evolve, as I think all of the greatest ideas eventually do. I'm going to talk to you about FOUC, and I'm going to talk to you about progressive enhancement. And I just want to make clear for the record that I am not at all qualified to give this talk. I'm not at all qualified to go outside of my normal realm, which is JavaScript, and to talk to you about this broader thing that is the web. But I can't think of any other conference that's better to start this conversation than a conference that is dedicated to the love of the front end. Because I love the front end, and I've made an entire career out of it, and many of you have as well. I deeply love the front end, and I care so much about the front end that I can't sit by and continue to watch us make what I consider to be some pretty bad mistakes. As all good stories start, let's start in the beginning. Way back at the very beginning, there was these kinds of websites. Actually, this was the very first website that Tim Berners-Lee created. And some of you may recognize this because recently there was a group of folks that got together and built the original web browser. This is what the first web browser looked like. They rebuilt it using modern technologies, but even true to the way fonts would have rendered back in the time. So that's kind of like what we could have expected in the very earliest days of the web. And eventually, after this first web browser was born, other web browsers followed after it, and we began to start to see how HTML rendering would happen. This was long before we had the concepts of styling or images or JavaScript or other things like that. This was just the earliest days of the web. 1991 was when it was created, and we're talking about those first few years of the web. This is what it was like. And it was great. It was fantastic. And of course, we moved forward with the web, and we started saying, let's create more interesting things. This is from the movie Space Jam. 1996 was when the movie was released and this website came out. And you notice that we now have a much more sophisticated and mature way of presenting our ideas on the web. We present them with these images and styles. And of course, many other things that we wanted to create on the web, like moving text. Apparently, we also like spinners a lot. We like these animated under construction graphics. And the best of all for the web was when we invented trailing mouse cursors. Because this is what we decided the web needed to become. Instead of this intercollected set of all of human knowledge, let's make it all of this stuff. And these were the early years of the development of the web. As we progressed in our ideas about what the web should be, we were exploring, we're spreading our wings and looking at all of these things. Now, I hope you'll agree with me that this is way too complicated, so we need to do just a little bit more changing of some settings. I'm going to simplify these slides a bit. So let's come up here and let's turn on reduce motion, and then also let's preload the images so we don't have any more of those spinners. Now, not only did we realize that we needed to mature and change how we were designing for the web, because that wasn't going to really be a great way to go forward for the web, we also realized that we needed to change how we build the web. So now we're moving out of what we can see on a web page, and we're going to talk about how those things are assembled, how they're built. And many of you are builders of the web, so you will identify with some of these things. If you've been around the industry long enough, you'll recognize things like this. You'll recognize putting your CSS inline styles and your inline event handlers directly into the HTML and building websites interactively that way. And if you've been around for this same period of time, if you remember this code, you probably also remember the great original religious war of the web was what we called separation of concerns, where we said, let's split all of these things into completely separate layers. And we called this separation of concerns, and we said, almost in a religious sense, that this is the morally more correct way to build the web. That it is unethical almost to consider building the web with everything mixed in together. Now it's interesting, I'll just make a side note that it's interesting that most of the modern framework development that has moved in the component direction is sort of revisited or rediscovered, reborn some of those original ideas. But for many, many years, we preached the gospel that you have to separate out all of your concerns. Now, it was not just about keeping these things more maintainable, although arguably I think these are more maintainable when they're split out, but there was a bigger idea involved in separation of concern that was often not talked about as much. This bigger idea was that we weren't just keeping them separate for the purposes of maintenance, but also so that the page, when it's delivering these things, can deliver them layer by layer. And when a website is loaded into a device that can handle all of those layers, they all show up. But if you have a device that doesn't handle one of those layers, then it doesn't show up. So in other words, these layers kind of stack almost like a birthday cake. That's one of the famous metaphors for separation of concerns. And so we can just think about them layering on, and because these layers become not required, that basically makes them optional. And so we began to develop these strategies for how do we build the web with this idea of optional layering. And two strategies began to emerge. Originally, the strategy that was most common would be what we would call graceful degradation. It's the idea of designing something perfectly, the way that you can dream it in your mind and building for that, but then also accounting for the idea that it might be loaded in some other sort of device that was less capable. For example, you might be loaded into a great device, but for some reason it may not have been able to load up the CSS, the styling, or maybe it's not able to load up the images or something like that. So the idea of graceful degradation was build it in the great way that you have in your mind, the way that designers have laid it out in Photoshop, but build it in such a way that if those extra optional layers fail to load for any of a variety of reasons, then the core functionality is still there. It can still gracefully degrade back to something not optimal, but certainly still functional. In other words, we can tolerate that less optimal experience. We, being users, can tolerate that less optimal experience because something may have gone wrong. We may have just had spotty Wi-Fi, and that may be the only reason why the CSS didn't download this time. Of course, almost all users, whenever they see an experience like that is obviously not the way that it was intended, what do? They click the refresh button. And they click it 3 or 4 more times before they decide, well, I guess this is the best that I'm going to get. A second strategy began to emerge several years later, and this is around 2003. And there was a talk that was given at South by Southwest, and this second strategy called Progressive Enhancement, it was coined basically to be the opposite of graceful degradation. For Progressive Enhancement, the idea is that you start with not the optimal version, but you start with that base core version of the web experience. That's what you design for. And then you think about all of these optional layers like we're talking about, styling and behavior, images, all those things. You think about them merely as enhancements. They're not part of what is required to experience what we want for you as our user or as our customer. We're just going to let them sort of progressively enhance your experience. Now, to be honest, this was mostly a mindset shift. It wasn't really a radically different approach to assembling the technology. We'll talk about more of that in just a moment. But really, they shared most of the same techniques. So if you think about it, it's really which one do you start with in your mind? Do you start with the core experience and then build and enhance on top of it? Or do you start with the full experience and allow things to be taken off when they don't work? The end result is generally the same, and we end up using generally the same building techniques. As I mentioned, there was a talk given in 2003 about this, and when they were talking about the idea, launching this idea of progressive enhancement, one of the slides in this deck listed out a whole slew of different hacks, essentially. Hacks that you do to get around all of, and you have to remember in 2003, we didn't have quite such a rosy browser landscape like we have today. There were a lot of differences between browsers, and so we had lots of different hacks to make sure that it looked just exactly the right way, or that this style sheet was only loaded for this particular version of some browser. And you can glance through some of these or look through this list. It's an interesting sort of archival look into the past. Some of those hacks even survive on style sheets today. The idea was, or the claim was, that we're focused on content in progressive enhancement, and that's part of the reason why the argument is made that it's morally superior to do so, because we're focused on the content, and that's such a pure and right-sounding thing, but the truth is that this was still all focused on the technology. We told ourselves that if we focused on the technology and we did all of these hacks on behalf of the user, it will be better for the user in the end run. I'm not sure if that's true. Now, as we began to create more and more sophisticated websites, as it got more and more popular, the web also got slower. And so the advent of web performance came about, web performance optimization. We needed to ship all of these things to the web, but we need to make sure that it didn't take minutes or hours to load. We need quick, snappy sorts of responses on the web because users aren't going to tolerate sitting around waiting for a minute or 5 minutes for your website. So we told ourselves, again, that if we can make things more performant, this will be better for the users. We developed all kinds of different strategies for optimizing the performance of our websites. And one of the most classic of all the recommendations was that you split up your resources and you decide based upon priority which ones are most critical, load those now, and then load other stuff lazily as you go along. And again, this sounds so morally correct. It sounds so right and it sounds so pure. But as soon as we started building things in this non-blocking way, we got this experience called FOUC. It's just like the slides at the beginning of my presentation when you see these flashes of things happening. And no, it's not the flash of uncolored character. It's the flash of unstyled content. When you see content that hasn't been properly applied to the styles and it janky moves around, it reflows and it restyles itself, that's FOUC. And as soon as we started dynamically loading things because that's better for the user, we created this experience called FOUC, which is definitely not better for the user. And if you were around as I was at this time in the web, people were coming up with all kinds of fantastic different sorts of techniques for getting around FOUC. I think we could argue that the whole age of spinners was invented specifically to get around this FOUC thing, because we don't have it loaded to just show a spinner in place of it. In a more recent context, we've had different variations of this same idea, flashing of unstyled things, basically. We have the flash of invisible text. This comes to us because now we're using web fonts everywhere. And web fonts are not always loaded. They are big, sometimes large resources that have to be loaded. And so you end up seeing text that either is completely invisible before it's rendered, or it's rendered in the wrong style. So you either have FOIT, for flash of invisible text, or FOUT, FOUT, for flash of unstyled text. We love to come up with these acronyms, don't we? Is this really better for the user? Is this really what the user wants out of their experience? We've been telling ourselves that if we put these pixels on the page more quickly, that that's going to be better for them. And by the way, I think probably the best of all, don't bother Googling this term because you won't find it. I coined this back in 2010 when nobody was listening to me. They're mostly not listening to me even today, but that's okay. FOUC stands for flash of unbehaviored content. When content shows up but the JavaScript isn't there to make it interactable yet. Anybody ever tried to click on a button or a link and it didn't do the right thing and you had to wait on it, the menu didn't load or something like that, or worse, you clicked on it and then the menu loaded and did things that you weren't expecting? What I love about this, it's really putting the FU back into the web. So we've been trying to get these things to load faster for the user because we say that that's better for the user, but then we've been creating all of these other problems and then inventing other solutions to those other problems, which create other solutions to other problems. The de facto standard, whenever you're getting into this mindset of web performance optimization, one of the de facto places you end up is webpagetest.org, an absolutely fantastic resource. Has tons of information. You can test your site. It gives you more data than you could possibly imagine about the performance of your website, how it's behaving. And it gives you suggestions, and there's tons of resources, information in this WPO space about what you should do. And one of the most common of all of those things is that we want to reduce the amount of time before the first pixel gets painted. The most commonly cited technique is this reducing the time to first paint. This is a view from webpagetest.org where you can get this film strip view, and it shows you for the first 1.5 to 2 seconds, it's completely white. The user can't see anything, and then all of a sudden the website begins to show up. And if we say, we've been saying to ourselves, we've been telling everyone that if we can shorten that amount of time so that there's something on the screen, some pixels there, as quickly as possible, that users will feel more confidence in it. And by the way, we're not making this up. There's tons of statistics that tell us, well, yes, users are going to spend more on your website if it loads faster. But just because it's loading faster, does that really mean that the user is liking it? Do they really like that behavior? I'm not convinced that just because they spend more money that correlates to them enjoying the experience. I'm not convinced that we've really been taking our jobs, most importantly, our jobs to build the web. We may have been optimizing for the money intake, but missing the forest for the trees. Have you ever really sat on a website and enjoyed that whole bouncing around of the reflows and the restyles? Have you enjoyed having placeholders that aren't useful information or all of the spinners all over the page? And yes, this is a real website. My credit card, one of my credit cards comes from Chase Bank, and this is really what it actually looks like when I load it from a fresh cache. And this is the pinnacle of what we've been building for the last 20 years on the web. We've been creating frameworks that make it easier and easier for you to put more spinners on the page. I think if we're being honest, users don't like these things. They merely tolerate them, and barely at that. They barely tolerate these things because it's just slightly better than the worst possible experience we could have given to them. And by the way, while I'm on the topic of web performance, I want to take just a side note to talk about service workers. Okay? If you don't know what a service worker is, this should be at the top of your list of things to go learn about from this conference. Because I'm going to make a claim that sounds kind of out there and outlandish, but this is the first of many of those that I'll make tonight. The claim that I'm going to make is every single website on the internet, without exception, needs to have a service worker. Every single one. It doesn't matter whether you consider yourself to be a progressive web app or not. You need a service worker. It's essentially a programmatic way to control all of the network requests from your web page. All of the requests, not just from your JavaScript AJAX calls, but everything. All the loads of images, style sheets. It allows you to programmatically control the caching behavior of your website, swap in or optimize different resources, load balance, all sorts of things. But the most important thing of all is the caching. Having a smarter caching so that when I read your blog post and I'm halfway through, and I'm standing in line at the airport, and then I put it in my pocket, I put the phone in my pocket, I get on the plane, we take off, and I have no more Wi-Fi. And I pull it out to finish your blog post, and the blog post is gone. That is a fundamental failure in the design and the build of the web. That the stuff that I had before is no longer here because I don't have an ISP right now, that is ridiculous. Service workers are arguably one of the best solutions that we've ever come up with to that. And I know many people say, well, caching should just be better. You should really look at the code of your favorite web browser if you want to see just how complicated caching strategies are. By having control of it with your own service workers, you can decide what is really what my users would expect here. And it's going to be different for every site, for every application. On the topic of progressive web apps, just for a moment. There's a number of technologies underneath this umbrella of progressive web apps, and I think by virtue of the fact that we're talking about the A, which often is referred to as accessibility, but by virtue of the reason that we're talking about applications, we're thinking this is only for applications, that this wisdom only applies there. And I would like to tell you that actually this stuff applies broadly to every site on the internet. We can all benefit from this idea of handling offline and spotty internet better. Service workers allow us to do that. We can also stop thinking about things in terms of what you cannot do, like your disability, and instead thinking about things in terms of what you can do, your ability rather than disability, and enabling and empowering people to get the most out of our experiences. This is fundamental to the web. Also, the idea of incremental. Yes, applications and even PWAs often do load themselves entirely all at once, and there's reasons for that. But the ability to incrementally update is one of the fundamental strengths of the web. And I'll make this bold claim. I think this is that these collections of reasons broadly apply to all websites, whether you're an application or not. These are why we're going to beat all of those shitty app stores. This is why the web is going to win, because the web is fundamentally better at all of these things than native apps are. Whether it's a website or a web application that gets a little icon on their home screen, we need to be taking advantage of this web technology. It's some of the most important stuff that we've created in the entire history of the internet. So what I'm getting at here is this idea of technology layered delivery of web applications or websites, this HTML, CSS, JavaScript thing. It may have benefits from the maintainability perspective, depending, you may be into components now and you're like, no, I want everything all in one file. So it may have benefits or it may not have benefits, but it's a lie to say that this is all about the user. Because actually, that distinction doesn't matter at all to the user. They do not care whether you have everything in one file or everything split out into 100 different files. They don't care about that technology. And the benefits are not flowing to them the way that we like to tell ourselves in our mind, the way we like to lie to ourselves and say, oh, it definitely flows to a better experience. That's not true. The non-technologist user never thinks, oh, cool, I see some content. Oh, awesome, now that content looks pretty, and even better, now it's fancy and interactive. They never have those thoughts. The thoughts that they really have are, why does this site take so long to be useful to me? What they really want is instant on. And we can't really give them instant on. Well, actually, maybe you could if you were using a really smart service worker that kept everything updated in the background. But we can't really give them instant on. We shouldn't be making technology choices that actually make their experience worse or more janky, and then patting ourselves on the back and saying, great job, we're doing a really great thing because we kept everything in separate files. I want you to imagine if you were, as a technologist, as all of you are, if you're on a website and you're watching some video, and all of a sudden it starts to pixelate for a little while, and then it goes back, and then maybe it pixelates a little bit later, and then it goes back to regular video. As a technologist, what you're thinking is, oh, that's really cool. They have a very intelligent player that detected the bandwidth of my connection at this moment, and it downsampled the frame to preserve the frame rate. You're thinking about all the technology, and you know what the user's thinking? What the hell is wrong with my ISP? Why is it always giving me crappy video? That's what they're really thinking. So as technologists, when we try to substitute in what a user actually thinks about, we use all of the bias of what we know about the technology, and we're making poor decisions for them. I know many of you probably know the story of Snow White. And in Snow White, the evil queen famously looks into the mirror and says, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the great conceit of that part of the story, maybe you've missed this before, but the great conceit of that part of the story is, whenever you look into the mirror and ask a question like, who's the best? Who are you going to see looking back at you? Yourself, right? Unless it's a magic mirror, and then we should probably talk about other things. But if it's a real mirror, you're going to see yourself. And so it goes with technology. That when you choose to ask a question like, what's the best user experience I can build? And then you look in the mirror of self-reflection of your own perspectives and your own desires, guess what's going to be reflected back to you? Yourself. You don't have the right perspective because you're looking in a mirror instead of really asking, what does the user want? You see your own self staring back. I just want us to admit this to ourselves. I want us to admit that these strategies are not really about what's best for the user. If they're good for the user, and that's even debatable, it's really just a happy side effect. It wasn't really about the user in the beginning. Or maybe it was and it somehow got corrupted along the way. I can't say that all of our founding fathers, if you will, of web technology, the Zeldmans and the Eric Meyers and the Jeremy Keys of the world, they are fantastic people. I love them to death. I think they're great. And we all have a career because of what they laid down for us. So don't hear me to be criticizing them and their motives and their intentions, but I just want to say that as a broad web development community, there's 11 million of us worldwide that are JavaScript developers, maybe even more than that are front-end engineers. As a broad community, we're basically telling ourselves this lie over and over and over again to make ourselves feel better. Every day we go in and say, oh, it's all about the user, and really, it's all about us. We're not asking what's better for them. We're actually asking, what's the least amount of work that I can do to make this work in all the possible devices? Think about responsive design, for example. Responsive design where you have all these CSS breakpoints and the flow and all that stuff. And I know every one of us that's played around with responsive design has sat there with the browser window and dragged it back and forth and seen everything reflowing, and we're like, that's so awesome. And you know how many of your users have ever done that? Here's a hint, 0. None of them have ever dragged a browser around just to see what it looks like at different sizes, ever. Because this isn't about them. We built that so that we could make the same app work with the same code in all of those different form factors. And I get why we've done it. I've been an app developer. I know why we do it. But we shouldn't be lying to ourselves that this is all about them. At best, if a user has ever experienced more than one configuration of your web experience, maybe they opened it on their phone and also on their tablet. At best, they're thinking, oh, this is really annoying that the phone layout is so much more limited. They're not thinking, oh, look how cool this was that they used the same CSS in both places. That does not occur to them. We're trying to save ourselves work and pretending it's about the user, and it's not. Now, that doesn't make those things bad. Progressive enhancement, responsive design, all those things, they're not bad. They're well-intentioned. It just means that our claims of them being morally better for the users, it's really kind of sketchy. The worst part of all, though, is that by making these lies, by perpetuating these lies to ourselves, we end up dividing ourselves. We end up dividing our community. If you have not read this blog post, it's by Chris Coyier, and I strongly recommend you go read it. It's a long, kind of drawn-out sort of a thing, but he presents a pretty good, I'd say, cross-section of this debate. Many people didn't even really agree with him before reading it that there was a divide, but I'm here to tell you there definitely is a divide within the front-end community. And Chris talks at length about why some of these reasons, why the divide is there, and maybe what we can do about that. I think he missed a few important things, so I want to share a few additional thoughts, but I'm not criticizing. This is a tremendously complex topic. I'm glad that at least somebody is starting this conversation so that we can talk about it. You see, on one side of this great divide, there are people that have grown up in the web, and they're great people. I'm not saying anything bad about them as people, but there are people that have grown up in the web and have had this very palpable disdain for one of the core technologies of the web, and that's specifically JavaScript. Specifically, they felt things like JavaScript should be just a last resort. If you can possibly do it with HTML or CSS, definitely that's the better and more morally correct way to build that experience, and only fall back to JavaScript if you absolutely have to. And this permeates lots of thought leadering within the web space. If it can be done better with HTML or with CSS or with both, it certainly makes sense to at least consider it, but to suggest that there is never a case where JavaScript might be better, that's just divisive. And it doesn't stop there. We've had other thought leaders that have said things like, if you can't develop for the actual web, find a different platform, in response to the idea that somebody might choose JavaScript first for their design and build of their application. Really? Can you stomach that condescension? Because I certainly can't. That's not healthy for our community, for us to be talking in terms of us versus them so strongly. And it goes on even further, because we blame JavaScript for all the problems of the web, especially all the problems that bloated adware sorts of things on the web are doing. And people are suggesting ridiculous things like, let's just have browsers arbitrarily cap the maximum size for JavaScript files. Because we're so desperate to fight back against that other side that doesn't understand us, let's just have the browser completely cut off at the byte. Doesn't matter whether that breaks the file, just cut it off if it's too big. That's the point of our discourse and our discussion at this point, is that we're just saying let's arbitrarily cap file sizes. Now, I know I'm picking on that side of the divide. And as a JavaScript developer, you think, well, that's pretty rich, right? He certainly has lots of criticism for them. There's plenty of blame on both sides. Because it's true that many, many JavaScript developers have had an all-out assault on the other side of the divide. This is a blog post. It was written a couple of years back, I guess 2013. Tom Dale, one of the creators of the Ember framework, and he basically makes this claim, which again, so me saying progressive enhancement is dead is not a unique or novel idea. People have been saying this, and he said progressive enhancement is dead. If you read this blog post, one of the problems with this argument is that he strawmans to attack only one part of progressive enhancement without understanding the fullness of what it was intended to do. He attacks this one part of progressive enhancement, which suggested that JavaScript could be optional in some cases, and he said because that is no longer true, he makes the claim that basically all of the web is now intrinsically related to JavaScript. I don't know if that's a legit claim or not, but that's the claim he's making. And he says because that's now true in 2013, then all of progressive enhancement is completely irrelevant. Now you're wondering why I would be criticizing that statement, because I'm here to also tell you progressive enhancement is dead. But it matters why. And it also matters what we suggest to replace it. And I didn't find this to be a particularly strong, this was a rather weak argument and short-sighted. The worst part of this argument is that it perpetuates, it feeds into this divide. Because all the people on the other side, when they read stuff they're like, oh, they don't get us, they don't understand us. They create the same sort of divide from us that we've been creating from them. Whenever you hear somebody in that side of the world tell you that your JavaScript is shit and should be capped or deleted from the web, does that make you feel like sometimes a little bit of rage inside? Imagine what it feels like when somebody goes and creates CSS in JavaScript and then writes a blog post saying inheritance and CSS is terribly designed, you can't figure it out, nobody can figure it out, so you should just go do it in this new thing. Imagine how they feel about that. They feel the exact same way that someone in the JavaScript world like me feels when you criticize JavaScript as being what's broken with the web. This is almost a religion at this point, and I'm not necessarily sure that's a great thing. But we obviously can't have intelligent, reasoned debates when it's so fervored up in all of this, like us versus them sort of stuff. I'm just going to go out here and say, if you are trying to write JavaScript and you're not a programmer, you're not an engineer, you're going to be frustrated because JavaScript is for the programmers and engineers. But by the same token, if you're trying to do HTML and CSS, which are intrinsically part of this thing called the web, you're never going to delete that. At least not in my career that I need to worry about. HTML and CSS are intrinsic parts of the web. And if you're going to try to do that stuff and you don't understand front end because you're just a JavaScript developer, you're also doing it wrong. There's plenty of blame on both sides. Let's just examine that for just a moment. Is no JavaScript even a relevant use case today? Some people say yes, some people say no. There's lots of statistics. I think the government of UK recently, a few years back, they said like 1.3% of their users either had JavaScript disabled or for whatever reason JavaScript didn't run when they loaded a government web page. And so there's lots of statistics out there that tell us that we should care about those 1.3%. Notably, those percentages are lower than the folks that have accessibility issues, and we don't care about them largely. But we have this righteous indignation that, or some people have this righteous indignation that the web has to work for that 1.3% of people that don't have JavaScript enabled. Now, I'm not actually here to make that case one way or the other. But I want to tell you that the case has been debated completely wrong because it actually has nothing to do with any of that data. There's only one thing that matters in this question of, is this relevant? And that question is it relevant to the kind of site or experience that you're trying to create? That's the only question that matters. And it's uniquely to you, to the system, to the product that you're building, to the experience that you're building. It doesn't matter what Google Analytics says. It doesn't matter what all those other statistics say. All that matters is for the people that you're trying to create, is there an experience that can reasonably be delivered without JavaScript? That's a question that you should ask. I don't have the answer to that. Let's look at an example. Maps. Most everyone here would group the idea of these fancy interactive maps under the general heading of a web application. It's incredibly interactive, you're zooming in and out and these cursors and paths being laid all over the map. the Google Maps JavaScript API. If you haven't worked with it, it's kind of unbelievable how sophisticated it is. This is an app. A map is an application. Just like you think about games. Like if somebody asked you, if you built this like first-person shooter game and delivered on the web, and then somebody were to suggest to you, every single web experience needs to have a fallback to HTML and CSS, you're gonna think, what? There's no HTML, CSS only equivalent of my first-person shooter. That's ridiculous. Of course, when you make a claim that's ridiculous like that, I'm gonna laugh at you. So the question that really matters is, are you trying to deliver an experience that can be built without one of these technologies? Maybe yes, maybe no. Now you're probably thinking, well, definitely not for the Google Maps, definitely not for the first-person shooter games out there, but actually for maps, it turns out, if you've been around the web long enough, you know, there used to be this thing called MapQuest. And it was a completely sufficient, workable mapping application that I'm not sure whether it had JavaScript or not, but it definitely didn't use all the JavaScript loading stuff. You click those little like blue arrows on the side of the map, and the page refreshed, and you got a new section of map. And that sounds so primitive and ridiculous to us in 2019, but it was perfectly workable. It was completely workable as a way to experience this sort of fallback. Or you could think about the JavaScript as that enhancement on top of an experience like this. So for them, there definitely was a thing. Notably, Google hasn't done that, but there definitely was a way to think about maps, even something that we think of as a web application, as maybe not so rich of a client-side application. There is some way to build for that. Now, I probably haven't yet convinced you that you should, but I just want to convince you that it is possible for things that we otherwise might not have conceived of as being possible. And it's a worthy discussion that you should be having within your teams. I debated having this as the very first slide of my talk, because this tweet actually came out like yesterday. Alex Russell works for Google, is one of the luminaries of the web, have a ton of respect for him. And he asked this question: what if you got up on stage at a web conference and you said to the people at the web conference, we're here to make users' lives better, therefore we should demonstrate that our technology doesn't do harm to them? And he suggests that we would start a fight. Well, here I am, Alex, standing on a stage at a front-end web conference saying that we shouldn't be thinking only about technology, we should be asking, are we not doing harm to our users by doing that? And I know that I'm going to offend some of you with these thoughts, but I hope there aren't any fists flying afterwards. Hopefully we can have a more peaceful resolution. So let's turn our attention to the user. Can we? Can we turn our attention to the user, but not like sort of abstractly, but like really? Can we shift that discussion in that direction? I've been using this term for a number of years as sort of a superset of responsive design. I've been calling this adaptive design, and it's like the application doing more than just changing to the screen size. It also responds, it monitors the conditions, and maybe it shifts rendering from the page back to the server or back and forth, things like that. I've been using this idea of adaptive design, and for a while I was like, this is what should replace responsive design. But I was wrong. Because adaptation is implying something that is really not a great idea for us to double down on. It's implying that we basically want automation of these decisions. Adaptation is this sort of automatic response, and it's an automatic response to a limitation. That's not a great vision casting for the future of the web, that all we can do is just wait around for somebody to automatically respond to that. If we can't figure out right now what the user really needs to have their best experience, and we're not. Trust me, we're not. But what if we didn't have to guess? Like, I know this sounds crazy, but what if there was like a way to know what the user wanted without having to guess? Maybe that might be a better way to go forward. Everyone seems to think of this idea of configuration as a dirty word, right? We say things like convention over configuration or best practices or things like that. I'm here to tell you that configuration is powerful and useful. It is not necessarily the case that the user wants to go and configure every little bell and whistle, because I'll tell you that almost every web user that you have ever had on any site or app that you have built have never opened up the settings in Chrome. They've never gone to Chrome:/flags or whatever it is and tweaked stuff. They've never done that. Those configurations are there and users don't do that stuff. So I understand why we say users will never configure things. But I want you to imagine buying a car that was designed and built the way that we design and build the web. You get into this car, you turn it on, and right off the bat, things like the accelerator and the brakes and the steering wheel work, but not the headlights or the wipers. So it's okay for you to start driving right now, unless, of course, it's raining or dark, and then that might not be a safe thing. But you'll figure it out, right? Eventually, those things will turn on. Oh, and by the way, the radio will eventually turn on, but it's tuned automatically to the station that it thinks you probably want to listen to based upon where it thinks you're going right now. There's no way for you to choose your streaming station or your radio station if you're old school like me. There's no way for you to do that. It's just tuned automatically, and there's no dials or anything here. Speaking of opinions, the car has a strong opinion on what the temperature should be in the car. We've already pre-decided that the best optimal temperature for you based upon the outside and where you are and what you've been doing and where you're going, we've already set that stuff, and there's no dials for you to change any of that. Because we can't trust users to do silly stuff like that, right? If a user really wants to turn off the radio, they can pull over to the side of the road, go into the trunk, and unplug a wire. That's good enough. That's ridiculous, right? We would never build products that way, and yet we build the web that way. We build the web saying we can guess all of these things. So what would it look like if we weren't building the web that way? What would it look like if we were trying to build a web that was more empowering to the user? You might immediately go in your mind to something like personalized design, personalizable design. And this actually is kind of a boring term, and it sort of harkens back to the early 2000s where like every web company in America had like a portal where you could like have your own like weather widgets and stuff like that. I don't know if any of you remember that, but that was like the personalized web. You could just have a portal and oh my goodness, you could do things like themes, like I want the dark mode theme on the web and all this stuff, right? But it could be so much more than that. Let's shrug off the baggage of what it was back in the early 2000s. Let's think about something that I would like to call imprintable design. Yeah, I'm trying to coin a term, and I'm not a marketing person, so somebody's probably going to be tweeting out right now, what a stupid idea. This is never going to catch on. But I like to talk about what I call imprintable design, as in the user is imprinting themselves onto the web experience. That's something a little different than what I've heard in our general discourse, that the design molds itself around the person, that it truly becomes theirs. I'm trying to divorce myself from thinking about, as a developer, as a builder, if I'm just on a website, wouldn't I like a website that felt, not in a creepy way, like it's making all these suggestions like, don't you want to watch this DVD? No, I don't, Amazon, thank you very much. Like, I'm not talking about creepy stuff like that. But let's use a shopping experience as an example. Maybe there's a shopping experience which doesn't even organize products into categories that employees figured out. Maybe you don't even have a thing like a shopping cart. Because for you, the website, the application knows that the way that you like to shop is sort of project-based. So you basically start by saying, here's something that I want to get done, and it automatically pulls some stuff together, and it's got it in this project space, and maybe another one over here, and you're just like picking and choosing and saying, yeah, that glue looks good, but no, I need this kind of tape. And under the covers, it's just automatically charging and refunding you. And there's no such thing as a checkout. And it's completely personalized, it's completely imprinted by you, the way that you like to do things, and that would be entirely different from how somebody else might experience that site. I know that's outlandish. Probably nobody's ever going to build something like that. But the point that I'm trying to prove is each shopping experience could be imprinted by the person, and it can be a lot more rich and interesting and useful than just, would you like to buy this item because this other thing is in your cart? So what I'm getting at here is that product design, user experience, UI design, all of these things, they come together, but they're really part of a bigger idea, imprintable design. Bringing all of those different disciplines together is what I'm talking about when I talk about imprintable design. Designing with all of those things in mind. And really, honestly, that's just people-centric design. I'm not trying to coin that phrase. Stick with imprintable design for the hashtags, okay? But it really is just people-centric design. Design that's focused on people. How often do we flip this backwards and prioritize the authors over the users? That question stings a little bit when I consider how many times I've done that in my career. There's a thing in our founding documents of the web, in the HTML specification, which if you have not read, you definitely should be reading by this point. And there's a thing there called the priority of constituencies. It's section 3.2, and you should go look it up. And here's what it says. It says, in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity. This is in our founding document. And 90% of you are just hearing that for the very first time. And that's tragic. Because I think that we have a unique and important responsibility. There are 7.6 billion people in the world, and less than 1/8 of 1% of the world is building the web for all the rest of that 99 and 7/8 of the world. And there's a unique and important responsibility that we have to those people. You know, the browser is often referred to as a user agent, right? Well, what does an agent do? An agent's kind of like a go-between, like they negotiate on your behalf. You don't really directly connect with the subject or the client. They act in between. They prepare things for you. So yeah, the browser is kind of like a user agent. But that doesn't really describe what I would like on my behalf, helping me to experience this thing that has been built for the web by other people. That doesn't describe how I'd like. I'd like to maybe call it a user gateway. A gateway is sort of like a passive entry into this experience. It gets out of the way and lets me immerse myself entirely in it. I wish we called browsers a gateway rather than an agent. And even better than a gateway, I wish that we called them advocates. Because an advocate helps me get the most out of my experience. It's not sitting in between me and the experience. It's helping me get the most out of it. The common theme here is that we've had the wrong mindset. We've been saying we're talking about the user, but we're not. That progressive enhancement has really been truly, if you get it down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's really been truly about the technology and the developers that build that. And actually what we should be focusing on is design that's primarily focused on each person, not a person, not like a theoretical person, but each and every person. I want you to remember this. This is tweet-worthy. There's human beings on the other side of those pixels. There really is. That's what we're supposed to be about. There's a flaw that leads us off track. And one of those flaws is that we have been designing for consistency of web experience. We've been designing so that we could have a consistent web experience. And if you think about it, if we're trying to reach each and every single person on the planet with our site and app, the most ineffective possible priority that you could imagine would be consistency. Why are we trying to build the web with all of this consistency in mind? Why do we hack in so that we get the pixels exactly right? Why do we do that? When there is so many people and so many different ways that people experience the web, why do we focus so much on, oh, it's got to be exactly the same. It's got to look and feel exactly the same on this phone as it does on a tablet. I'll tell you why, but you're not going to like the answer. The answer is pride. This is what's been driving many of our bad decisions, and I'm entirely included in this because I've been doing it for 25 years. We take far too much pride in our ability to use technology to hack all these pixels together because somebody told us that users are going to buy more if the button is properly spaced. No non-technical user in the history of the web has ever pulled up two browsers side by side on two different devices and then got out their little measuring and measured the pixels and then said, well, I'm not going to buy from this site because the pixels are off. It's never happened, period. That's not how the web works. No non-technical user has ever bounced away from your site because you used native form controls and they look different on Mac versus Windows or Android versus iOS or Chrome versus Firefox. And they're like, ugh, this native form controls, I'm so offended, I'm not going to buy your TV. That's never happened, ever. It's kind of like artists. Now, some of you that design for a living, you know the idea of being an artist. You understand being an artist. But if you're a builder of the web, you might not readily identify as an artist. But I'm going to say from this perspective, from this mindset, we're all within that same umbrella as an artist. Artists really like to control. They're okay with people having their own interpretations of their art, but they want to control the way that it is experienced. It's kind of like this dude, George. When he retconned Star Wars and tried to convince us all that Han didn't shoot first, he was doing so because as an artist, he had a statement that he wanted to make. And all the rest of us are like, no, I'm sorry, Han shot first. I saw the original movie before he went and changed it. But artists, they like to control these things, and the same is true of the web. We like to control these things and make sure that it's exactly the way that we've envisioned and the way that we've designed and the way that it looks in the Photoshop file. We should not be if we're building for this tremendous diversity of the web, we should not be cheering for and celebrating convergence. The device diversity that exists on the web. Think about all the different phones and tablets. Think about the robots and light bulbs and all these other things that are eventually going to be either are or going to be connected, and they're going to be our gateway, our portal, our advocate for experiencing the web. That's a tremendous amount of divergence, not convergence. Convergence is not the virtue here. Divergence is the real virtue. It's what we should be planning for, and it's what we should be celebrating. Another great lie, by the way, this is maybe one of the greatest. If the device can do it, the user wants it. We built our entire technology stack around the idea that we're going to maximize what you can experience. If we detect that you can support WebGL on your phone, we're going to serve WebGL to you. If we detect that you can have Retina images, we're going to serve Retina images, right? Because we think the user definitely wants the maximal experience. It turns out that's not really actually what the user wants, but we have this mindset of maximization. Let me give you an example. I load up your web app that serves me bus routes, and I'm in the US, and I have full battery power and unlimited internet on my T-Mobile provider or whatever, and I load up the bus route, and you detect that my phone supports WebGL, so you start serving me the bus routes and all this like 3D rendered goodness, right? And I'm like, oh, that's clever and cute. But I'm still getting the benefits out of it. I'm able to get the bus routes. Now, I am your customer, I am your user, right? Then I get onto a plane, and I fly over to somewhere here in Europe, and because I have T-Mobile US, that means that I get free internet when I'm roaming, and I spend actually a large portion of my life traveling internationally. I get free internet, but guess what? It's at 2G speeds. All right, so I was your customer and user, and I still have your app opened up in my browser. But now, it's raining. It's like 3 minutes to midnight. I know the last bus is about to go, and it's raining, and my battery is on 3%. And I pop open the bus routes web app to try to get my bus routes. The assumption that you made before is no longer valid, because guess what? I don't want your WebGL. How do I tell you that? The answer is I don't. The answer is I can't tell you what my reality is, because you've been guessing what my reality is based upon this faulty assumption that if my device could do it, then I definitely wanted it. And that's sometimes true and sometimes not. And that really is this fundamental flaw. So I keep talking about users and customers, but how do you really decide who those people are? How do you really know who those people are? Well, the answer is you ask these folks. How do they know? Well, first, they ask their sales and marketing departments to go look at Twitter trends and Google search trends to tell you what users really want. And then they ask the business analysts, hey, based upon your market analysis and research, what do you think users want? But ultimately, they basically turn to Google Analytics, and they make all their decisions based upon what people are currently doing. This is how we design our products, based upon this data. Data, it'll save us. Just let the data decide. I've worked for, I can't even tell you how many companies that have said that. You know, Mark Twain said about statistics, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. And the truth is that statistics marginalize people. We're designing these things based upon statistics, so it should be an obvious outcome that at least some people are being marginalized. And we think about this UX as a field of study, as a field of expertise. And I'm not saying anything bad about the user experience folks. I had a job for 2 years as a user experience person, working on the product management team at a company. But UX is basically just play-tested averages, right? We've just tested it across a number of people, and we've figured out what's the average best, which means there's a whole bunch of people on all sides that aren't getting the best. The common thread across everything that I've been saying is that we think that we know better, but do we? When we apply this average generality to individuals, it doesn't work. So, accessibility, we need to talk about that for a moment, because this is one of the easiest things to shuffle off. It's one of the easiest things to forget about, and mostly because data. Mostly because somebody looked at some data somewhere and decided that you're not making enough money to make it worth your time to create something that is accessible. And I could go on for an entire talk about why that is complete bullshit. that every single user is your user, even if they become disabled permanently or temporarily, or they have some sort of accessibility issue, like they used to be able to use your site, but now they have a newborn in their arm, so they only have one hand available to experience it. Like, it's complete bullshit that we don't think we have data that tells us that everybody is our user, regardless of their abilities, their capabilities. But what I want to really focus on is, in the word accessibility, it's a rather low bar to think about all we've done is just check the check mark that they have basic access so that we don't get sued. Really? That's the collective best that we've got after 25 years of building the web. We can just make sure that some people don't sue us because they can still access our site. How about a different acronym? We love these letter, number, acronym things. How about E5Y? How about empathy? Empathy-driven instead of accessibility-driven. What would that look like? It's a little bit higher bar because now what we're trying to do is empathize with people. We're trying to understand the conditions that they may be in. Even if we don't understand them, we're trying to put ourselves in that place, and we're trying to say, you deserve that sort of respect. But an even better one than E5Y would be E12Y, empowerability. Okay? E12Y says, let's go for the highest bar of all, which is that we're empowering people. You notice over and over and over again, I've deliberately shifted this conversation from users to people. Because users really implies like utility and a very narrow purpose. Our only relationship to them is what they're going to do on our site or in our app. That sucks. Customer is even worse because it means our only relationship is what you mean to us for money. Oh, that's so gross. People. Person means that we recognize and celebrate their autonomy, their agency, their individuality, and their merit. That's how we ought to be building the web. Those are the kinds of web experiences we should all want for ourselves, and we should want them for all the rest of the people that experience the web as well. It's people who use these things. Whether it's a site or an application, it's people who use these things. There's another flaw. That flaw is that the browser knows best. I have in my occasion of what I do, speaking and teaching, I get to talk to a lot of people that work at browsers. And some of the ideas I'm sharing with you are not new. There are things that I've been ranting about to various different people that I know at different browsers. I even went and worked for one for a while. I've been ranting about some of these ideas for many years now, actually. And I've been trying to convince them, hey, we should do this. And the response that I get is, well, no, the browser can figure this stuff out best. That's essentially why they don't do any of these things that put the user really first, is because actually at the end of the day, browser developers think they know what's best. The truth is that the only one who really knows is that person. Can the browser device know anything better than the person? Yes, they can. For example, the browser can know and the device can know if CPU and memory is available. Check, we definitely know that it can do that one better. But there's a bunch of other things that we need for them to be able to communicate or need to be communicated on their behalf. Like, for example, do they have unlimited power? We normally think about this in terms of, oh, well, I can just plug in and recharge. Doesn't matter if I'm on low battery. I got on a plane years back, and I flew to a remote rural village in the middle of somewhere Botswana. And I went into this village, and they have one single light pole in the center of the village with one electrical wire that was running from some nearby village. There's like 100,000 people living in the general area. 20 people live in every single house. It was kind of mind-blowing because it was so different than anything I'd ever experienced. And you know what I saw when I went up to this pole that was in the center of the village? Dozens and dozens, maybe more than that, phones plugged in, hanging down off of this pole. It sounds ridiculous to us, right? But for them, it takes like an entire day to recharge the phone. And they have to pay for it. Could be an entire day's wages to pay to recharge their phone. We just take that stuff for granted. We think, oh, power's not a big deal. Everybody can always recharge. Have you ever thought to yourself when you went to recharge one of your devices, this is going to cost me some money? Probably not. Maybe in like an airport or something, but not in your fancy cubicles at your office. So what about data? Can we know if they have unlimited data? Nope, we can't know that either. We might know something about their ISP, but we don't know about their data plan. We don't know what it's costing them. And we don't know, importantly, if they're willing to pay for this data or not. The device can't figure that stuff out. It cannot guess that. What about if their hands are usable or free right now? We don't know. They used to be, but we're not really sure if a touch interface is exactly right at this moment. Because maybe now they need to be in hands-free mode and they need to be talking to your website. How do they communicate to you that their context has changed? The answer is they don't. And here's one that a lot of people forget. How do we even know if they have proper lighting to see all the stuff, all those pixels that you're painting on the screen? The answer is we don't. We don't know if they're able to see what we're giving them. The device can't know these things. Only the user can. So can we please just ask the person? Is that such a novel idea? Can we ask them and can we take that feedback into account in terms of what we deliver for them? And by the way, here's a couple of quick examples of this. Pick your font size. Some of you may have seen this on the web, some of you may not have not, but it is a thing that on websites there used to be like these little selectors and you could pick the font size. This was heralded mostly as an accessibility thing, but I think it makes a bigger point, which is I don't really know what size text you want, so if you want to change it, go for it. So you can change the size of the text. And this is actually on a whole bunch of different websites. I found this with just a little bit of Googling. Found examples of websites that have this. Here's New York Times. They have a thing that where you're clicking and it's literally increasing the font size for you. And that's not just a quirky idea. That was actually an endorsed use case by the W3C. They have a whole page about this idea of letting people pick their font sizes. If we can imagine that that's a good idea from an accessibility perspective, I want you to broaden your perspective that would be a really good idea for all users of the web. Not just for people that maybe have sight troubles and they're not able to zoom in on the screen or something like that. Here's another example. I don't know if any of you have ever seen when loading up Gmail, but they have that little link there that says load basic HTML. And if any of you have ever clicked on that before, it actually pops up a basic, non-Ajaxy, non-JavaScript version that's completely functional and I can check my email. And you may think, well, nobody would ever use that unless they were on bad bandwidth. And the answer is, when I want to leave Gmail open for a really long period of time, guess what I don't do? I don't leave the big fancy website open in my background. I open up the basic version of it because I don't want it chewing up my battery power. Remember Google Maps earlier? Why can't they just do this and fall back to whatever MapQuest did back in 2005? The myth here is that people always want the most powerful experience possible. And they'll always choose that, and that's not true. I read this story, and then I asked my good friend Bruce about this because he used to work for Opera. Opera Mini, a browser that like 1 billion or more people use, by the way. Opera Mini is in the habit, at least for some web properties, of serving a more basic, a more simplified version of a website. And one example is Facebook. For billions of people, potentially, they have been experiencing a version of Facebook that was served and optimized specifically for the browser that they were in, okay? Now, I know this looks like super primitive to us, and then we think, well, certainly if they got a more powerful phone, they would want the more powerful Facebook, wouldn't they? Well, it turns out this was actually tried. They tried increasing the capability of this app. They tried switching it out to a more fancy version of Facebook for people when an Opera Mini upgrade came out or something like that. They tried switching it to a more powerful version of the experience, and they got millions of complaints of people saying, please go back to the better version of it. Because it turns out users know better than we do. And we're just afraid to ask them. So I started out saying that progressive enhancement is dead, that we need basically a new term. I know we love acronyms, so we can't get away from this PE thing. We need a new term. So we could talk about progressive experience. We could talk about personalized experience. But here's the best PE of all, people empathy. See, you get to keep the same acronym. You just shift your focus in terms of what you're building. The ideals of progressive enhancement are meritorious, but it was the approach and the mindset that need to shift. So, how do we begin this? I've been sharing these ideas, casting this vision, but how are we going to do this? This is just one idea. This is not the only or even the best idea. It's just some food for thought.
And by the way, if you're looking for a moral imperative, here's a moral imperative. People must be given the choice. It is no longer good enough from here on out. It is no longer good enough that we choose for them. They must be given the choice. We have to figure this out. As builders of the web, that is our responsibility to take seriously. It's a guiding light. And now that you've heard me say that, you're on the hook. Every decision that you make from here on out that doesn't put the user first is an irresponsible decision. So, how do we do this? This is my vision of it. I think that users understand some basic, what I would call currencies. For example, they understand things like speed. They understand if they're using something and it starts to make their device slow and then they close it and their device is fast again, they understand that that thing was making them slow down. They understand that it was costing them speed. They don't have to understand anything about CPUs or any of that stuff, but they do understand it's not as good when I run this app. And that's the reason why a lot of apps get downloaded and within 5 minutes get uninstalled, because it makes the device slow. So they understand a currency like that. They also understand a currency like battery level. I use your app and my battery drains really fast, and that sucks, and that actually costs me money. I don't use your app anymore. Same thing with websites. I could call out many, many, many websites out there that kill my battery level, and I don't even leave them open in my browser as a result. But another one that's actually a real currency is the cost that they pay in bandwidth. These are things that users understand intuitively, even if they don't know anything about technology whatsoever. Grandkids gave them a basic feature phone that sort of has a smart screen in it or something like that for Christmas one year, and they're just trying to check and see some photos of their kids at a baseball game. They don't know anything about the technology, but they understand this stuff. This stuff matters to them, and we ought to be asking them, hey, how much of that are you willing to spend at this moment? In your context, how much are you willing to spend? And honestly, this is not only the person, but it's also the browser. In unison, the two of them together decide, what kind of experience do I want to have? What kind of experience will be best for me at this moment? And we ought to have a very simple way for a user to communicate where they fall on that spectrum of those currencies. That's literally all we need. We don't need them to go into Chrome flags. We just need for them to describe essentially the fidelity that they want out of the experience. So this is what I imagine. You're on a web browser, and then you just drag down from the top, and now there's a little slider up there. And this is your fidelity slider. And on the far right-hand side, you're saying, I'm willing to spend as much as it takes to get the best possible experience. And that's where it defaults for every website, so nothing breaks. But maybe a user says, right now, I really need you to take up less of my resources. I need a more basic experience. So they just drag the slider a little bit over to the left. And then the slider goes away. And then later they drag the slider down and they change it again. Is it really that complex to imagine that a user could say something like, I want a better experience or maybe a little bit more lean of an experience at this exact moment? Now, it's important that not only they be able to express that, but that we be able to know what they've expressed. So, for example, we need to send that header along to the server. A number that's been computed by both the person's expressed preference and what the browser knows about their context. It's an opaque calculation that sends along some number that says, this experience should be 0.87 of the most possible experience, whatever that means. And I'm not trying to suggest a universal definition for that. I'm trying to suggest a very dependent version of that for every single website. That sites and apps need to decide, they need to be built in, not layers of technology, but degrees of fidelity. That's how we need to start dividing things up. Not into HTML, CSS, not even into components, into degrees of fidelity. So, similar to responsive design breakpoints, you could have configuration for these different fidelity breakpoints. And you could decide, I'm going to serve different resources, and I'm going to serve the simpler version of my calendar widget right now, or the more complete version of the widget. You can permeate this as deeply into your app as you need to, or as low level as just simply switching out from regular to retina images. But you can have a configuration for your site that knows what to do with that header. And it can be very declarative. So the server's going to decide, should we send or should we skip? Should we select a different feature or component, or maybe not ship it at all? Don't ship the news feed if they've asked for a lower fidelity. And we're going to alter the behavior, like, for example, batching up requests, or switching on and off the SPA mode so it just goes back into normal page load, or even treating it as if it's an offline, and then when they have a better fidelity experience, then you can sync things up. These are all things that an app could do if we just knew what they wanted at that moment. If we just asked them, what do you want? What's best for you right now? And this is probably the most controversial of all. The browser's going to have to step in with a veto vote if your server decides to ignore that information. If the user says, I want a low fidelity version of the site, like if it's less than 30%, and you still ship all these retina images and fonts and stuff, the browser's got to say, I'm not even downloading that stuff. Because that doesn't fit what the user wants right now. You didn't pay attention to their expressed priority. So as I draw to a conclusion, you're going to be asking yourself, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to convince people to do this? How am I going to start? And one of the most important questions you could ask is, should we just wait until browsers do all this stuff for us? And let me say emphatically, no. I can tell you for sure that the browsers are not going to build any of what I just said. They're not going to build it anytime soon because nobody on the web is going to take advantage of that right now. They won't build that, and they won't start asking users, what do you think about the experience, until we have set the precedent that we care about what they want. We can start building this into our apps, even if it's not built natively into the browser. It's like the font size selector, but on steroids. We ask the user, what do you want right now? It could be as simple as the Gmail thing with a basic link off. And then you can go more complex into that. Now, I know there's a ton of objections here. You're going to be thinking to yourself, well, my boss is never going to approve this because it sure sounds like this is going to cost a lot more for us to do. I'm not convinced that it's going to cost a lot more for us to do. I actually think there's a possible way for this to be done maybe even simpler than what we do now. But what I do know is that if you wait around for some stakeholder to give you the thumbs up stamp of approval, nothing ever changes, nothing ever evolves. The whole reason why you're using React is because somebody on your team decided that that was going to change things for you, and somebody made the case. And I'm saying that it is your moral imperative for you to go make the case that the user's experience is going to be better. And if the user's experience, if the person's experience is better, then we have a more loyal customer, we have a more loyal user. And all those other things, like all the extra work and the extra money, are going to fade once you've already built these things. Don't ask your boss, just do it. Ship it. And then show your boss, look what we can give the user. Show them the statistics of how much happier they are. So I'm going to leave you with a quote on one of the blog posts that I found in my research for this talk. There's a blog post that was talking about progressive enhancement. It was basically saying that we're getting it all wrong, and it was basically kind of chastising JavaScript developers a little bit for having all these misconceptions or not even understanding JavaScript themselves. And here's what their final ending claim, this was their final point to be made of why we still need progressive enhancement. It's kind of a curious one. They said, nobody has disproved the benefits of progressive enhancement or proposed a better technique. Have I? I say that progressive enhancement is dead. But that doesn't mean it goes away. All those same great ideas evolve into something better. I say long live this people empathy in printable design. Thanks very much for listening to my thoughts.